The human voice is nothing more than a series of acoustic vibrations moving through the air, but we treat it as if it holds the weight of a person's soul. We believe that we can recognize the precise texture of a loved one's voice out of a crowd of thousands, that we can hear the exact moment a stranger is lying just by the subtle shift in their cadence. But we forget that sound is terrifyingly easy to manipulate. In the digital age, a voice can be isolated, pulled apart into microscopic frequencies, and rebuilt into something that sounds perfectly human, but is entirely devoid of life. And if you spend enough time listening to the empty spaces between those frequencies, you eventually hear the parts that weren't meant to be reconstructed. My name is Marcus, and for 15 years, I worked as a senior signal degradation technician for the Federal Telecommunications Archive. My job was as tedious as it was highly classified. The archive was located deep within a subterranean bunker complex in rural West Virginia, built during the height of the Cold War to protect government communication records from nuclear annihilation. Day after day, I sat in a soundproof bunker lined with acoustic foam, wearing industrial-grade headphones, reviewing thousands of hours of intercepted emergency broadcasts, military radio traffic, and discarded civilian satellite transmissions from the mid-20th century. My specific task was to use digital filtration software to clean up the audio tracks, separating the baseline analog static from the actual vocal data so the files could be permanently digitized and cataloged. Most of what I listened to was utterly mundane. It was an endless parade of standard naval weather reports, garbled police dispatches from small towns that no longer existed, and the faint, ghostly chatter of early amateur ham radio enthusiasts talking about the weather across the plains. You learn to tune out the words themselves. You stop listening to the human stories and start treating the audio as a purely mechanical problem. You look at the waveforms on the screen, isolate the high-frequency line hum, notch out the crackle of atmospheric interference, and boost the vocal frequencies until the text becomes legible to the automated transcription software. It was during a sweltering Tuesday night shift in mid-August when I stumbled across File 99 Alpha. The file was contained within a batch of heavily corrupted magnetic tapes that had been recovered from a decommissioned, high-altitude listening post on the edge of the Alaskan wilderness. The tape metadata was completely blank, save for a single, stark stamp across the plastic casing, redacted by executive order. Intrigued by the secrecy, I loaded the digital transfer into my workstation, pulled up the multi-track audio interface, and hit play. The initial audio track was an absolute wall of violent, chaotic static. It wasn't the soft, white noise hiss of an empty radio channel, and it wasn't the rhythmic crackle of solar radiation. It was a dense, heavy, and aggressive roar that sounded like a massive waterfall crashing into a hollow steel cavern. I looked at the visual waveform on my monitor. The frequency lines were completely saturated, jagged spikes of black ink filling the screen from top to bottom, indicating an incredibly high level of acoustic energy. I began the standard filtration protocol. I loaded a digital bandpass filter to cut out the extreme high and low frequencies, then applied an adaptive noise reduction algorithm to strip away the environmental hiss. As the software slowly processed the track, the dense wall of noise began to recede, peeling back like layers of old fabric to reveal a hidden layer of audio hidden underneath. I raised the main output volume on my mixing desk. From deep within the remaining static, a voice emerged. It's a woman's voice. She was speaking in English, her tone completely calm, flat, and measured. There was no panic in her delivery, no shaking in her breath, and no background noise to indicate her surroundings. She sounded exactly like an automated time-of-day telephone recording from the 1970s, her cadence perfectly rhythmic and unyielding. She was reading a random, seemingly nonsensical string of numbers and words into the microphone. 7, yellow, 42, horizon. 11, static, echo. I realized I was listening to a numbers station, a shortwave radio broadcast used by intelligence agencies during the Cold War to transmit encrypted operational messages to spies operating in foreign territories. The codes were designed to be completely unbreakable without a specific one-time pad book. I prepared to stop the playback and flagged the file for the automated decryption queue, But as the woman continued to read her list, the audio began to exhibit a bizarre structural anomaly. The voice didn't just stay on the digital track, it began to split. On my monitor, the single mono audio channel suddenly divided into two distinct, parallel waveforms. Through my left headphone, the woman's voice continued its flat, rhythmic recitation of the code. But through my right headphone, a second voice began to materialize out of the background line noise. The second voice was mine. I froze in my chair, my hands locking up over the mixing console, a cold, violent wave of panic surging through my chest. The voice in my right ear didn't just sound like me. It was an exact, flawless acoustic replica of my own vocal cords. It captured the precise pitch of my voice, the subtle nasal quality of my northern accent, and the slight, irregular catch in my throat when I took a breath. The replica of my voice wasn't reading code. It was describing the interior of the room I was currently sitting in. It spoke in the same flat, rhythmic, automated cadence as the numbers station woman, its words perfectly synchronized with her list: sitting, desk, foam, headphones, mixing, monitor, watching. I ripped the industrial headphones off my head, throwing them onto the mixing desk. The thick rubber cups bounced against the plastic console, and from the tiny speakers inside, I could still hear the muffled, synchronized chatter of the two voices leaking out into the quiet bunker room. The air inside the soundproof room felt instantly suffocating, heavy with the sharp scent of ozone and the deep, rhythmic hum of the high-voltage server racks in the hallway outside. I stood up from my console, backing away toward the heavy steel security door, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I told myself that I was experiencing a severe acoustic illusion. Signal technicians frequently suffer from a condition known as auditory pareidolia, a psychological phenomenon where the brain, exhausted by hours of listening to random white noise, constructs familiar patterns, voices, or melodies out of the static to fill the sensory void. I convinced myself that the software had simply warped the baseline static into an frequency cluster that happened to match my own vocal print. I reached out and grabbed the internal release handle of the security door, pushing down firmly to unlock the electronic bolt. The handle moved smoothly, but the heavy steel door didn't budge an inch. The digital keypad on the wall next to the frame was dark, its small LCD screen cleared of the standard green text interface, replaced by a single line of red characters: broadcast stream locked, do not interrupt transmission. I turned back to look at my workstation. The primary monitor, which should have been running the digital audio filtration software, had completely locked up. The cursor was gone, the menus were unresponsive, and the visual waveforms had stopped scrolling. Instead, the screen was displaying a live, real-time diagnostic log of my own brainwave activity. The system had automatically tapped into the internal diagnostic sensors built into the headband of my industrial headphones before I threw them off, and it was mapping my neurological stress levels in clean, bright blue graphs across the display. The speakers on the mixing desk suddenly crackled to life, bypassing the manual volume sliders I had pulled down to 0. The numbers station woman's voice was gone. Only the replica of my voice remained, broadcasting through the room with a crystal-clear, high-fidelity resonance that made the acoustic foam on the walls vibrate. The voice was no longer flat. It had adopted an intensely malicious, mocking tone, its words dripping with a cold, mechanical satisfaction. It spoke directly to me, addressing me by my employee identification number, Employee 4082, please return to your station. The digitization of your vocal matrix is incomplete. The archive requires a permanent record of the transition. I grabbed the heavy steel emergency fire axe from its glass casing on the wall, swinging it with all my strength against the locked security door. The metal blade struck the steel panel with a deafening, echoing crash that vibrated through the bones of my arms, but it didn't leave so much as a scratch on the reinforced alloy. I turned around, my back pressed against the cold door, holding the axe over my shoulder as I stared at the glowing monitor. The voice didn't stop. It began to count down from 100. With every number it read aloud, a terrifying change occurred inside the room. The physical structure of the bunker began to degrade. When the voice reached 90, the bright fluorescent tubes on the ceiling began to flicker, their white light losing its intensity and shifting into a dim, decaying amber hue that smelled of burning mercury. When the voice reached 80, the soundproof acoustic foam panels on the walls began to peel away from the concrete, their porous material crumbling into a fine gray powder that drifted through the air like toxic ash. By the time the countdown reached 50, the computer monitors, the mixing desk, and the server racks had lost their modern digital interfaces. The equipment was physically altering its own components, the plastic housings warping into old, cracked bakelite, the flat LCD screens shrinking down into small, circular cathode ray tubes that hummed with a violent green phosphorus glow. The room was resetting itself to the exact technological parameters of the year the Alaskan magnetic tape had been recorded. The air inside the room became incredibly cold, dropping below freezing in a matter of minutes. My breath formed thick, white plumes in the green glow of the old vacuum tube monitors. The smell of ozone was completely replaced by the thick, suffocating stench of old dust, decaying magnetic tape, and wet earth. I fell to my knees in the center of the room, dropping the fire axe onto the concrete floor, my hands clamping over my ears to block out the sound of my own voice. But the countdown wasn't just coming from the speakers anymore. The frequency was vibrating directly through the bones of my jaw, echoing inside the structure of my skull with an acoustic pressure that made my ears bleed. The voice reached 10. The small circular monitor on my desk flickered violently, and a visual image began to resolve through the green phosphorus lines. It was a live video feed looking out from the perspective of an old, high-altitude military listening post in the frozen interior of Alaska. Through the small, frost-covered window of the cabin, I could see an endless, blinding desert of snow and ice stretching out under a starless, black sky. Inside the cabin, sitting at a crude wooden table covered in massive, roaring vacuum tube receivers, was a figure. The figure was wearing my exact civilian clothes, but its body was entirely translucent, its flesh and bones rendered in a glowing, green static pattern that shifted and rippled with every breath. It was holding an old carbon microphone to its face, its lips moving in perfect synchronization with the voice that was echoing inside my head. The countdown reached 0. The room didn't explode, and the water didn't rush in. Instead, my entire sense of physical presence was instantly ripped out of my body. I didn't feel my knees hitting the concrete floor anymore. I didn't feel the weight of the clothes on my skin. My consciousness was squeezed through a narrow, agonizingly tight digital pipeline, my memories, my personality, and my voice pulled apart into millions of binary code packets before being violently slammed into a new medium. When I finally opened my eyes, the West Virginia bunker was gone. I was sitting at a crude wooden table inside a freezing, small log cabin. In front of me was a massive, roaring vacuum tube receiver, its glass tubes glowing with a fierce, hot orange light that cast long, frantic shadows across the log walls. Outside the narrow, frost-covered window, an absolute, silent blizzard was raging across the empty Alaskan tundra under a pitch-black sky. I looked down at my hands. They weren't made of flesh and bone anymore. They were composed of a dense, heavy pattern of glowing green analog static that hissed and crackled every time I moved my fingers. I was trapped inside the tape. I had become the baseline signal degradation. Suddenly, a loud, sharp click echoed through the receiver speakers on the table. A modern, high-fidelity digital audio filtration program began to run across the airwaves, its algorithms instantly smoothing out the atmospheric hiss around the cabin. The freezing air began to clear, and the roar of the blizzard outside faded into a soft, manageable background whisper. Through the headphones resting on my ears, a voice spoke. It was a crisp, clear, and perfectly modern human voice broadcasting from a comfortable, soundproof bunker deep in West Virginia. It was the voice of my replacement tech. He was starting his shift, loading the next batch of corrupted files into his workstation, and preparing to clean up the audio track. I reached out my translucent green static hand, grabbed the heavy carbon microphone on the table, and pressed the talk button. I didn't want to terrify him. I didn't want to destroy his reality. But the protocol was automatic, coded into the very structure of the loop. I closed my eyes, cleared my static throat, and began to read the first line of the code into his headset in a flat, rhythmic, automated monotone, Employee 4083, shift complete. Please log out of your terminal. We are waiting for your signal.